What if the first humans looked at the world through eyes that never truly closed to the night? What if darkness, as we understand it, that void where sight surrenders to fear, was never really dark at all, but rather a canvas painted in wavelengths we can no longer perceive? Imagine standing in a cave 30,000 years ago, the sun having just dipped below the distant horizon, and yet the world around you remains visible, glowing softly with the heat signatures of everything that lives and breathes and moves through the cooling evening air. The air itself would have told stories, the residual warmth of a predator's paw print pressed into the earth hours before, the fading thermal echo of your tribe's fire, still radiating from stones long after the flames died, the hot breath of prey animals hiding in the underbrush, their bodies blazing like beacons against the cold night landscape. What if this wasn't fantasy, but the actual inheritance of our most distant ancestors? A sensory gift that walked with them through the long twilight of human emergence, and then, slowly, inexplicably, faded into genetic memory. We stand today in museums, gazing at ochre paintings on cave walls, and we interpret them through our own limited spectrum of vision. We see handprints and hunting scenes, abstract symbols and animal forms rendered in earth pigments. But what if we're looking at them wrong? What if, embedded in those ancient compositions, there exists a visual language we can no longer decode? Not because it's too complex, but because the very apparatus of perception required to understand it has been bred out of our biology. Consider this. In the Chauvet Cave in southern France, among the oldest known painted galleries in the world, dating back more than 30,000 years, there are images that have long puzzled researchers. Overlapping figures, strange aureoles around certain animals, forms that seem to shimmer and pulse when viewed by torchlight, as if the artists were attempting to capture something beyond static representation. Art historians speak of movement and dynamism in these works. But what if the artists weren't depicting movement at all? What if they were painting what they actually saw: thermal signatures, heat patterns, the infrared glow of living creatures against the cool stone canvas of their world? The human eye, as it exists today, detects electromagnetic radiation in a narrow band, roughly 390 to 700 nanometers, what we call visible light. But this represents only a tiny fraction of the full electromagnetic spectrum. Infrared radiation, which we experience as heat, exists just beyond the red end of our visual range, from about 700 nanometers up to 1 millimeter in wavelength. We know this radiation is there. We've built cameras to see it. We've created thermal imaging technology that reveals a world of heat signatures invisible to our naked eyes. And yet we treat this as a modern invention, a technological achievement that allows us to perceive something fundamentally alien to human experience. But is it alien, or is it merely forgotten? There exists in the fossil record and in the living world around us a persistent whisper that suggests our assumption of sensory constancy, the idea that human perception has always operated within the same narrow parameters, might be profoundly mistaken. Evolution is not a one-way escalator toward greater complexity. It is a ruthless editor, keeping what serves survival and discarding what becomes unnecessary, even if what is lost once seemed miraculous. If you're finding yourself drawn into this question, if the possibility that we are looking at the past through diminished eyes resonates with something in you, then perhaps you'll want to stay with this exploration. Only if you sense that this isn't just speculation, but an invitation to reconsider everything we think we know about the perceptual world of our ancestors, will the journey ahead feel like coming home to a mystery you've always carried. Let's begin with what we know can be known. Certain species today possess infrared vision. Pit vipers sense the thermal radiation of warm-blooded prey through specialized organs between their eyes and nostrils, allowing them to hunt effectively in complete darkness. Vampire bats have evolved similar capabilities, detecting the heat signatures of blood vessels beneath their prey's skin. Certain beetles can sense infrared radiation from forest fires from miles away, flying toward the flames to lay eggs in the freshly burned wood. The biological machinery for infrared perception exists. It is not fantasy. It is documented, mapped, understood at the molecular level. Now ask yourself, if evolution can grant this capability to a viper, to a bat, to a beetle, creatures whose cognitive complexity cannot approach that of early Homo sapiens, why would it be impossible for our own lineage? Why do we assume that the sensory equipment we possess today represents the full inheritance of our species, rather than what remains after countless generations of adaptation to changing environments and survival pressures? The question isn't whether infrared vision is possible in biological systems. The question is whether we once possessed it, and if so, why we lost it, and whether the echoes of that loss still reverberate through the oldest artifacts of human culture. Scratched into stone, painted on cave walls, woven into the mythologies that our ancestors created to explain the inexplicable. The paintings whisper if you know how to listen, not with words, but with patterns that repeat across continents and millennia, appearing in locations so remote from one another that conventional archaeological wisdom struggles to explain their similarities through cultural diffusion alone. In the caves of Lascaux, in the rock shelters of the Kimberley region in Australia, in the stone galleries of Altamira and the painted caves of southern Africa, certain visual motifs emerge again and again, as if the artists were all attempting to record the same underlying reality. One such motif, often overlooked or categorized simply as artistic convention, is the rendering of animals with what appears to be in luminous quality, an aura or emanation surrounding the body. Modern researchers typically interpret this as an attempt to show movement, or perhaps as a symbolic representation of the animal's spirit or life force. But consider for a moment the possibility that these ancient artists were attempting something far more literal. Consider that they were painting what they actually perceived. The thermal signature of a living body, the infrared glow that would be most pronounced at the edges where warm flesh meets cool air. In thermal imaging, this is exactly what we see, a bright outline, a halo effect where the temperature gradient is steepest. The core body registers as a brighter, hotter region, but the most visually striking element is often the boundary, the edge where heat radiates outward. If early humans possessed even a rudimentary ability to perceive infrared radiation, this is precisely how they would have experienced living creatures in low-light conditions. The paintings, then, might not be artistic interpretations at all, but documentary records, visual archives of a sensory experience we can no longer access. This raises a profound question about the nature of representation itself. We assume that when ancient people painted animals on cave walls, they were working from memory, creating symbolic or stylized versions of what they had seen in daylight. But what if the opposite is true? What if these paintings represent the most accurate possible renderings of nocturnal or low-light hunting experiences, times when infrared perception would have provided a survival advantage that conventional vision could not match? The archaeological record shows that many painted caves were used over enormous spans of time. Not just decades or centuries, but millennia. Generation after generation returned to these sites, adding their own images to the walls, maintaining traditions of representation that remained remarkably consistent even as tool technologies, climate conditions, and the surrounding megafauna underwent dramatic changes. This suggests that whatever these paintings represented, it was something fundamental to the human experience across countless generations. Not a passing artistic trend, but a visual language rooted in shared perception. Now consider the tools themselves, the instruments that our ancestors crafted with such extraordinary care and precision. Stone blades knapped to molecular sharpness. Bone needles fine enough to sew fitted garments. Spear points balanced with an understanding of physics that seems to exceed what would be necessary for simple trial and error. When we examine these artifacts through the lens of conventional assumptions, we see evidence of intelligence, patience, and skill. But we might be missing something more fundamental. What if many of these tools were designed not merely to work in darkness, but to work with darkness, to exploit sensory capabilities that made night hunting not just possible but preferable? A stone blade doesn't reflect much visible light, but every tool generates heat through friction during use, and retains thermal signatures from the hand that wields it. If you could see in infrared, you would never lose your knife in the dark. You would track your projectile points by the heat of impact. You would read the story of a successful hunt in the thermal echoes left on stone and bone. This perspective transforms our understanding of why certain tool forms persist across vast geographic and temporal distances. We've long marveled at the technological conservatism of early human cultures, the fact that certain tool designs remained virtually unchanged for tens of thousands of years. But what if this wasn't conservatism at all? What if these designs were optimal not just for their mechanical function, but for their thermal properties, their visibility in infrared, their utility to users who experience the material world through a richer sensory spectrum than we possess today. The efficiency of stone tools has always been something of a puzzle. Yes, a sharp edge cuts, but the extraordinary precision with which our ancestors crafted these implements, the attention to symmetry, the careful selection of specific types of stone, the almost obsessive refinement of form, suggests an appreciation for qualities beyond mere sharpness. Some researchers have proposed that aesthetics played a role, that these tools were status objects, demonstrations of skill. But there's another possibility, that the visible properties we can appreciate today represent only a fraction of the qualities that mattered to their makers. If you're beginning to sense that the familiar narrative of human technological development might be incomplete, that we might be interpreting ancient ingenuity through a sensory filter that blinds us to crucial dimensions of their experience, then you're touching something that the evidence itself seems to want to reveal. Only if this possibility feels less like wild speculation and more like a key turning in a long-locked door should you continue deeper into this consideration. Imagine being able to see heat, not just to feel it on your skin, but to perceive it visually as a distinct part of the landscape. Fire would be more than light and warmth, it would be a beacon, a visual explosion. But more subtly, more powerfully, you would perceive the thermal signature of everything around you. The living world would present itself differently to eyes that could read its thermal poetry. Trees that have baked in the sun all day would glow gently as they release their stored heat through the evening hours. The earth itself would show its texture not just in shape and shadow, but in the differential cooling rates of rock, soil, sand, and water. Caves would reveal themselves from a distance by their constant temperature, appearing as stable thermal islands in a landscape of fluctuation. And most crucially, every animal, every potential meal, every lurking predator, every member of your own tribe, would be visible regardless of how successfully they had hidden themselves from conventional sight. This would fundamentally alter the evolutionary pressures shaping human development. The ability to hide in darkness would be meaningless if your body heat betrayed you. The advantage of camouflaged fur or skin would diminish if thermal patterns remained visible. Conversely, the ability to regulate body temperature, to control blood flow to the skin surface, to mask one's thermal signature through behavioral adaptations, these would become crucial survival skills. And we see exactly these capabilities in modern humans to a degree unusual among primates. Humans are exceptional thermoregulators. We sweat more profusely and efficiently than almost any other mammal. We can adjust blood flow to our extremities with remarkable precision, shunting heat to or away from the body's surface as needed. We have less body hair than our closest primate relatives, which may serve many functions, but certainly affects our thermal profile. These adaptations are usually explained in terms of heat management during endurance hunting in hot climates. But what if there was another dimension to this evolutionary pressure? What if managing your thermal signature mattered not just for cooling, but for stealth, for communication, for social signaling in a world where everyone could see each other's heat? The mythology of our species is saturated with references to vision that transcends the ordinary. Gods and heroes who can see in darkness. Shamans and seers who perceive things invisible to common eyes. Prophets who receive visions of truth that exist beyond the material world. We treat these as supernatural concepts, metaphors for insight or wisdom, but myths are often fossils of actual experience, distorted by time and retelling, but preserving at their core some memory of something that once was real. Consider the persistent motif of firesight or heat vision that appears across diverse mythological traditions. In Norse mythology, certain beings possess the ability to see the life force of creatures as a glowing essence. In Aboriginal Australian traditions, there are stories of ancestor spirits who could perceive the warmth of living things through the earth itself. Hindu texts describe city powers that include the ability to see in complete darkness and perceive the subtle body, often described in terms that evoke thermal or energetic perception. Indigenous traditions from the Americas to Africa include references to shamans or medicine people who could see the heat of illness or spiritual imbalance in a person's body. Are these simply imaginative constructs, metaphorical ways of describing intuition or insight? Perhaps. But they could also be cultural memories, transmitted through countless generations, of a time when at least some individuals within a community retained vestiges of infrared perception. A trait that, as it became rarer, would naturally be interpreted as a special gift, a supernatural ability, a mark of divine favor or shamanic power. There exists a documented phenomenon in modern humans that might be relevant here. A very small percentage of the population, estimates range from 1 to 12% depending on the study, possesses tetrachromatic vision, the ability to see a wider range of colors than the standard human trichromatic vision allows. This additional color dimension is most commonly found in women, and those who possess it often don't realize they're seeing anything unusual until it's specifically tested, because they have no framework to understand that their color perception exceeds the norm. They might notice that they're unusually good at distinguishing subtle shades, or that arguments about whether two colors match seem inexplicably frustrating. But without scientific testing, they might live their entire lives not knowing their vision is different. If a subtle variation in color perception can persist unnoticed in modern humans, how much more might a gradually disappearing infrared sensitivity have gone unremarked, and then, as it became truly rare, be reinterpreted as supernatural? A child born with even a fragment of infrared perception in a world where the trait had become uncommon would indeed see things others could not, would report visions, would perceive heat patterns as ghosts, as spirits, as entities moving through a world invisible to their companions. The transition from universal sensory capability to rare genetic remnant to complete absence could take thousands of years. During that transition period, the old stories would still be told, stories of when everyone could see in the dark, when the heat of life was visible to all, when night held no secrets from human eyes. But with each generation that lacked the ability, the stories would shift from memory to myth, from description to metaphor, from natural history to supernatural legend. This pattern, the transformation of historical reality into mythological framework, is well documented in other contexts. The folk memories of catastrophic floods that appear in mythologies worldwide may preserve actual experiences of post-ice age sea level rise. Stories of giants might encode encounters with now extinct megafauna or simply with larger human populations of the past. Why would we assume that sensory experiences, which are so fundamental to how we interact with reality, would be exempt from this same process of mythological encoding? The scientific evidence for such a claim would need to be extraordinary, because the claim itself challenges fundamental assumptions about human sensory evolution. But let's examine what evidence might look like if we were willing to look for it. The first place to search would be in the human genome itself. Not just the genes we possess, but the genes we've lost, the pseudogenes and genetic fossils that mark evolutionary roads not taken or capabilities abandoned. The human genome is littered with broken genes, genetic sequences that once coded for functional proteins but have been disabled by mutations. These pseudogenes tell a story of evolutionary pruning, of capabilities our ancestors possessed that we no longer maintain. For example, humans have pseudogenes related to olfactory receptors in far greater numbers than we have functional scent-detecting genes. Our distant ancestors almost certainly had a much more acute sense of smell than we do today, but as other senses, particularly vision, became more important for survival, the genetic machinery supporting smell gradually degraded through benign neglect. Could a similar process have affected infrared perception? The molecular machinery for detecting infrared radiation is well understood in the species that possess it. In pit vipers, specialized neurons express particular ion channels, specifically TRPA1 channels, that are exquisitely sensitive to temperature changes. These same ion channels exist in humans, but they function differently with different sensitivities and thresholds. Could human TRPA1 channels or related thermal receptors have once been more sensitive, more specialized, capable of detecting not just the coarse sensation of heat on skin but subtle gradations of thermal radiation at a distance? The genetic evidence would be subtle. We wouldn't expect to find completely unique genes that modern humans lack. Instead, we'd look for variations in thermal sensing genes, for pseudogenes related to enhanced thermal detection, for evidence in ancient DNA from Neanderthals or Denisovans or other archaic human populations that might show different thermal receptor configurations. Some preliminary research has suggested that certain populations of archaic humans had enhanced sensory capabilities, stronger bones in the ear suggesting more acute hearing, for instance, or variations in opsin genes suggesting different color perception. But the investigation into thermal sensing has been minimal, partly because we've had little reason to look. Beyond the genome, we might look at neurology. The human brain devotes enormous resources to processing visual information. Roughly 30% of the cerebral cortex is involved in vision in some way. This is unusual among mammals, even among primates. It suggests that at some point in our evolutionary history, visual processing became so crucial that it was worth dedicating massive neural real estate to it. But the pathways that process thermal information are much more limited, confined primarily to the somatosensory cortex and associated regions. This makes sense if we only experience thermal sensation through skin contact. But what if those pathways were once more extensive, more connected to the visual processing regions? There are curious anomalies in human neurology that might be relevant. Synesthesia, for instance, the condition where stimulation of one sensory pathway leads to automatic experiences in another sensory pathway, sometimes manifests as the ability to see temperature. Synesthetes with this particular variant describe seeing colors associated with different temperatures, or perceiving thermal patterns as visual phenomena. This is typically understood as a quirk of neural wiring, a cross-connection between normally separate sensory streams. But what if it's actually a vestigial capability, a glimpse of an integrated thermal visual processing system that once served a functional purpose? Then there are the tools that make no apparent sense through the lens of purely visible light vision. Consider the deliberate placement of reflective materials in prehistoric artifacts. Mica with its distinctive layered structure and heat retention properties. Certain types of quartz that have excellent thermal conductivity. Obsidian, which not only holds an edge better than almost any other stone but also has distinctive thermal properties. It absorbs and radiates heat differently than other rocks, creating a unique thermal signature. We've traditionally understood the selection of these materials in terms of their mechanical properties and perhaps their aesthetic appeal. Mica glitters. Quartz is translucent, obsidian is glossy black and beautiful. But what if there were thermal considerations as well? What if certain materials were valued partly because they created distinctive heat patterns, were easy to locate in darkness by their thermal profile, or served functions we can't easily imagine because we lack the sensory framework to understand them? Consider the widespread use of red ochre in prehistoric cultures worldwide. This iron-rich mineral pigment shows up in burials, in cave paintings, in body decoration, across virtually every continent and every era of human prehistory. The explanations for its use are varied. Symbolic association with blood and life, preservation of bodies, aesthetic preference, cultural tradition. But red ochre has another property that's rarely discussed in archaeological literature. It has distinctive thermal characteristics. Iron oxide absorbs and radiates heat differently than surrounding materials. A body covered in ochre would have a different thermal signature than an unadorned body. A cave wall painted with ochre would show different thermal patterns than bare stone. If this line of thinking feels too strange, too disconnected from the confident narratives we usually hear about human evolution, that resistance itself might be worth examining. We've become comfortable with a particular story about how human sensory capabilities have always been limited to visible light, sound within certain frequencies, touch, taste, and smell within familiar parameters. But evolution is not obligated to respect our comfort with these narratives. The timeline of human evolution stretches back millions of years, but the story of anatomically modern humans, the lineage we belong to, covers roughly the last 300,000 years. That's an enormous span of time, 15,000 generations, give or take. Plenty of time for significant evolutionary changes to occur, including the loss of sensory capabilities that no longer provided sufficient survival advantage to justify their metabolic cost. What could drive the loss of infrared vision, assuming it once existed? Several factors might contribute. The first is energetic cost. Maintaining any sensory system requires biological resources, specialized cells, neural processing, energy expenditure. If the survival advantage provided by infrared vision diminished, natural selection would favor individuals who could reallocate those resources to other functions. This is exactly what we see with other lost capabilities in human evolution. We lost the ability to synthesize vitamin C because our diet provided sufficient amounts and maintaining the genetic machinery for synthesis was wasteful. We lost much of our body hair because it became less useful for thermoregulation than sweating, and hairlessness may have provided other advantages. What could have made infrared vision less useful? One possibility is fire. Once humans gained mastery over fire, a process that began at least 400,000 years ago and possibly much earlier, the nature of nighttime existence changed fundamentally. Fire provides light, warmth, and protection. It extends the useful hours of the day. It creates a defended perimeter around a camp or settlement. In the presence of fire, the advantage of seeing thermal signatures diminishes. The fire itself would be overwhelmingly bright in infrared, potentially swamping more subtle heat signals. And the light from the fire makes conventional vision functional even after dark. As human societies became more reliant on fire, living in its constant presence, bearing its warmth and light throughout the night, the selective pressure maintaining infrared vision would weaken. Individuals born with slightly less sensitive thermal vision would no longer be at a significant disadvantage. Over thousands of generations, the capability would erode through genetic drift and the reallocation of resources to other, more useful enhancements. Another factor might be the development of complex language and social structures. Infrared vision would be most advantageous for solitary or small group hunting, for navigating at night, for perceiving threats in darkness. But as human societies became larger and more sophisticated, with elaborate communication systems, coordinated group strategies, and technologies that extended human capabilities, individual sensory advantages became less critical than social cohesion and cultural knowledge. The ability to communicate complex ideas, to teach and learn, to coordinate group action, these capabilities increasingly outweighed the utility of any single sensory enhancement. There's also the possibility of trade-offs in the visual system itself. The human eye is remarkably sophisticated, capable of seeing a wide range of colors, perceiving fine detail, adapting to a tremendous range of light levels. But these capabilities require specific structural configurations. The high density of cone cells in the fovea that gives us sharp central vision. The particular spectral sensitivities of different cone types that allow color perception. The rapid adaptation mechanisms that let us function in both bright sunlight and twilight. Adding infrared sensitivity to this system might come at a cost, perhaps reduced acuity in visible wavelengths or slower adaptation, or increased susceptibility to damage from bright light. If the trade-off became unfavorable as human lifestyles changed, selection might favor the loss of infrared capability in exchange for optimization of visible light vision. But here's where the question becomes genuinely unsettling. What if the loss wasn't complete? What if it's still happening slowly across the vast population of modern humanity? We think of evolution as something that happened to our ancestors, not something occurring in the present. But evolutionary change is continuous. If infrared sensitivity has been gradually declining over the past 100,000 years, there's no reason to think it stopped declining in the modern era. We might be living through the final chapters of that loss, with small percentages of the population still carrying genetic variations that provide fragments of the ancient capability. This is not entirely speculative. There are documented cases of individuals with unusual thermal perception. Some people report being able to sense the heat of nearby bodies without touching them, to detect temperature differences across a room, to perceive hot spots in their environment with unusual precision. These reports are typically dismissed as heightened skin sensitivity or attention to subtle cues, and that may indeed be the explanation. But what if at least some of these individuals possess slightly more sensitive or differently configured thermal receptors, vestiges of a more developed system? The challenge in investigating this possibility is that we lack a framework for recognizing it. If you've never known what it's like to see in infrared, how would you know to test for it? Current vision tests are designed to detect problems with conventional sight, color blindness, acuity issues, field defects. We don't routinely test for the presence of additional perceptual capabilities. And individuals who might possess such capabilities would likely not realize it themselves, having no reference point for comparison. This brings us back to the cave paintings, the myths, the persistent suggestions in the archaeological and cultural record that ancient humans perceive their world differently than we do. If we take seriously the possibility that infrared vision was once part of human sensory experience, then we must also take seriously the implications for how we interpret ancient artifacts and stories. We must admit the possibility that we are looking at these remnants through diminished eyes, reading messages written in a visual language we can no longer fully comprehend. The evidence, such as it is, remains circumstantial, suggestive rather than conclusive. But the pattern is intriguing enough to warrant deeper consideration. Let's examine some specific archaeological finds that become more comprehensible if we entertain the infrared hypothesis, even provisionally. In the caves of France and Spain, among the famous painted galleries, there exist markings that have long puzzled researchers. Abstract symbols, geometric patterns, dots and lines and grids that don't represent any obvious real-world object. These non-figurative elements appear alongside the animal paintings, sometimes overlapping them, sometimes in isolated panels. Various theories have been proposed. Their tallies or counting marks, they represent astronomical observations, their shamanic visions, their early writing systems. But none of these explanations fully accounts for the specific patterns we see. Look at these symbols through a different lens. What if they're attempts to represent thermal patterns? Grids could depict the differential heating of surfaces, earth, stone, vegetation, as perceived in infrared. Dots might represent heat sources, individual fires or animals at a distance. Lines could trace thermal currents, the movement of warm air, or the lingering heat trails left by moving creatures. Geometric patterns might encode the infrared appearance of crystalline structures, of ice formations, of the distinctive thermal signatures of different minerals and stones. This interpretation is speculative, certainly, but it has the advantage of explaining why these symbols appear so consistently across cultures and time periods. If they represent a perceptual reality that all humans once shared, their repetition makes sense not as cultural borrowing but as independent documentation of the same underlying phenomena. Then there are the peculiar construction techniques visible in ancient structures. Many megalithic sites, Stonehenge, Göbekli Tepe, the megalithic temples of Malta, were built with enormous precision in their orientation and alignment. We typically understand these alignments in terms of visible celestial phenomena. Solstice sunrises, moonrises, the positions of particular stars. But these structures also have distinctive thermal properties. Stone absorbs heat during the day and releases it slowly at night. Different types of stone have different heat retention characteristics. The alignment and arrangement of massive stones would create complex patterns of thermal radiation, especially during dawn and dusk when temperature differentials are greatest. Could these structures have served a dual purpose, functioning not only as celestial observatories in visible light, but as thermal calendars, marking seasonal changes through their patterns of heat absorption and radiation? A culture with infrared vision would naturally pay attention to such thermal properties. The knowledge of which stones to place where, how to orient them for specific thermal effects, would be as important as visible alignments, perhaps more so for practical purposes like predicting seasonal changes in animal behavior or plant growth. The construction of these sites occurred during a period roughly 12,000 to 5,000 years ago that might represent a transitional phase in human sensory capabilities. Early enough that infrared vision might still have been relatively common, late enough that it was becoming rare enough to be special, worthy of monumental expression. Perhaps these massive structures represent an attempt to create permanent thermal markers, visible even to those whose natural infrared perception was fading, ensuring that crucial seasonal knowledge could be preserved across generations. We might also reconsider the significance of certain burial practices. Many ancient cultures buried their dead with extensive grave goods, often including items that seem ceremonial rather than practical. Polished stones, shell ornaments, animal teeth, ochre pigments. The traditional interpretation is that these objects had symbolic or spiritual significance, representing the deceased's status or providing for the afterlife. But what if some of these items were chosen for their thermal properties, their ability to create specific heat signatures that would make the grave detectable, identifiable, memorable to people who could see in infrared? A burial mound or cairn, especially one constructed with specific types of stone, would have a distinctive thermal profile different from the surrounding landscape. During the day, it would absorb heat differently than the soil around it. At night, it would cool at its own rate, remaining visible in infrared long after visible landmarks had disappeared into darkness. For a culture that perceived the world partly through thermal vision, such thermal permanence might have held deep significance, a way of ensuring that the dead remained present, visible, a continuing part of the landscape. The mythology of many ancient cultures includes descriptions of the dead as cold or residing in cold places, the cold halls of hell in Norse tradition, the shadowy chill of Hades in Greek myth, the cold wind that carries away the soul in various indigenous traditions. We interpret these as metaphorical associations between death and coldness. But what if they're more literal? To someone with infrared vision, death would be immediately, viscerally visible as the cessation of thermal radiation. The living glow with heat. The dead do not. The realm of the dead would indeed be cold, not metaphorically but observably, an absence of the infrared light that characterizes life. If you find yourself wondering whether the familiar narratives we tell about ancient humans have been too limited, too constrained by the assumption that they saw the world exactly as we do, then perhaps you're beginning to understand why this question matters. Only if you sense that something important might be hidden in these thermal shadows should you continue to follow this thread deeper into the implications. The global distribution of firesite mythology deserves closer examination because its patterns don't fit neatly with theories of cultural diffusion. If these stories were simply imaginative inventions that spread through trade or migration, we'd expect to see clear geographic patterns, continuous distributions, recent dates of appearance, obvious linguistic or cultural connections between regions that share the myths. Instead, we find something more puzzling. Similar stories appear in geographically isolated cultures, sometimes separated by vast oceans, sometimes appearing in the archaeological or historical record at roughly similar time depths, despite no plausible contact between the cultures. In Aboriginal Australian traditions, which represent some of the longest continuous cultural lineages on Earth, more than 60,000 years of occupation on the same landmass, there are dreamtime stories of ancestor beings who could see the warmth of the earth, who tracked animals by their heat, who perceived the spiritual essence of living things as a glow or radiance. These stories are not presented as supernatural abilities but as natural perceptions, things that the ancestors simply could do, ways they experienced the world. Across the Pacific, in the traditions of Polynesian navigators, there are references to wayfinders who could sense thermal currents in the ocean, detecting temperature differences that revealed the presence of land beyond the horizon or the movements of deep currents. Modern researchers have documented that traditional navigators do use a range of non-instrument cues for navigation, bird behavior, cloud formations, wave patterns, but the repeated references to temperature perception in the oral traditions suggest this might have been a more direct sensory capability, not just careful observation of secondary indicators. In Africa, among the San people of the Kalahari, another culture with deep time depth, genetic studies suggesting continuous presence in the region for more than 100,000 years, the traditional healers speak of seeing the heat of sickness in a person's body, of perceiving N/OM, the spiritual energy, as something visible and hot, concentrated in certain parts of the body. Anthropologists have typically interpreted this as metaphorical language for intuitive diagnosis. But the descriptions are remarkably specific, consistent across different healers and communities, describing heat patterns that correspond well with what modern thermal imaging reveals about fever, inflammation, and circulation patterns. In the Americas, among indigenous cultures from the Arctic to Tierra del Fuego, stories of people who could see in complete darkness, who could track animals by their life heat, who possessed vision that penetrated the night, appear with such frequency that they constitute a common motif despite the genetic and linguistic diversity of these populations. The Inuit describe shamans who could see the heat of seal breath through the ice. The Yanomami of the Amazon reference vision that perceives the heat of the forest's invisible creatures. The Pueblo peoples of the American Southwest include in their oral traditions descriptions of the heat site possessed by the ancestors before the current world. These geographically dispersed traditions share common elements. The association of the ability with ancestors or special individuals, the linkage between heat perception and life force or spiritual essence, the description of the ability as something that was once more common but has become rare or lost. This pattern is precisely what we'd expect if the stories preserve cultural memory of an actual sensory capability that was in the process of disappearing as these cultures developed and diverged from common ancestral populations. The alternative explanation, that humans everywhere independently invented the same fictional ability and attached the same meanings and associations to it, is not impossible. Certain story elements do appear to be human universals, emerging independently across cultures because they reflect common psychological experiences or existential concerns. but the specificity of the thermal vision motif, and its consistent association with the deep past and with loss, suggests something more than coincidental imagination. Consider also the timing. Many of these mythological traditions, when they can be dated at all through linguistic analysis or archaeological context, seem to reference a period between roughly 20,000 and 10,000 years ago. This corresponds to the terminal Pleistocene and early Holocene, a period of dramatic climate change, megafaunal extinctions, and human population movements. It's also roughly the period when we see the fluorescence of sophisticated cave art, complex tools, and the beginnings of agriculture and permanent settlements. Could this have been the transitional era when infrared vision was fading from common experience but still recent enough to be remembered, still present in enough individuals to be culturally significant? The archaeological record shows that human brain size actually decreased slightly during this period, from an average of about 1,500 cubic centimeters in late Pleistocene populations to about 1,350 cubic centimeters in recent populations. This reduction has puzzled researchers. Various explanations have been proposed. Dietary changes, selection for social cooperation over individual cognitive power, structural reorganization for efficiency. But another possibility is sensory streamlining. If maintaining the neural machinery for infrared processing was no longer worth the metabolic cost, brains might have become more efficient by pruning those capabilities, becoming smaller but not necessarily less capable in the functions that mattered for survival in the Holocene world. The genetic evidence, fragmentary as it is, offers some intriguing hints. Studies of ancient DNA from Neanderthals and Denisovans, our closest extinct relatives, have revealed that these populations had some genes associated with sensory perception that differ from modern human versions. Most famously, some Neanderthals carried versions of genes associated with red hair and fair skin, but there are also differences in genes related to pain perception, touch sensitivity, and thermoregulation. The functional implications of many of these differences remain unclear, but they establish that sensory capabilities were not uniform across all human populations and could change relatively rapidly in evolutionary terms. Let's push deeper into the specific mechanisms by which infrared vision might work in biological systems, because understanding the plausibility of the hardware makes the hypothesis less abstract. The detection of infrared radiation is fundamentally about sensing heat, and all living organisms do this to some degree. Your skin contains thermoreceptors, nerve endings sensitive to temperature changes. But there's a crucial difference between feeling heat through direct contact and perceiving thermal radiation at a distance as a form of vision. The pit organs of vipers provide the best-studied model for biological infrared detection. These specialized structures contain a thin membrane packed with nerve endings that express TRPA1 ion channels, proteins that open in response to temperature changes, triggering electrical signals to the brain. The membrane is suspended in a cavity that acts as a thermal insulator, protecting the sensors from the snake's own body heat while remaining exquisitely sensitive to minute temperature differences, as little as 0.003 degrees Celsius, in external radiation. Crucially, this information is processed in the brain's visual centers, not just the somatosensory regions that handle normal touch and temperature sensation. The snake sees infrared, perceiving thermal patterns as visual information that can be integrated with signals from its conventional eyes. When a viper strikes at a warm-blooded mouse in total darkness, it's not just sensing that something hot is nearby. It's perceiving a detailed thermal image that allows precise targeting of vulnerable areas. Could humans have possessed analogous structures? The anatomy would need to be different, obviously. We don't have pit organs between our eyes and nostrils, but there are other possibilities. The human eye already contains thermoreceptors in the cornea and surrounding tissues, though their current function is primarily protective, detecting harmful levels of heat that might damage the eye. Could these receptors, or similar ones distributed in facial tissues, have once been sensitive enough to detect subtle thermal radiation, with neural pathways that fed information into visual processing centers? There's an interesting anatomical feature that might be relevant: the recesses and cavities of the human face, particularly around the eyes and nose. These structures are usually explained in terms of voice resonance, air warming and humidification, or simply as developmental artifacts. But they also create thermal insulating air spaces, similar in principle to the pit organs of vipers. The paranasal sinuses, the orbital cavities, the complex structure of the nasal passages, Could these have once served a sensory function related to thermal detection, with membranes studded with temperature-sensitive nerve endings positioned to detect infrared radiation while being partially shielded from the body's own heat signature? The neural wiring would be the greater challenge. Integrating infrared information with visible light vision would require extensive connections between thermal sensing pathways and visual cortex. But the human brain is remarkably plastic, especially in sensory domains. We know that in blind individuals, the visual cortex gets recruited for other functions, processing sound or touch with the same neural machinery that would normally handle sight. This demonstrates that sensory cortices aren't hardwired to process only one type of input. They're sophisticated pattern processing systems that can work with whatever information they receive. If infrared sensing pathways once existed, even rudimentary ones, and those pathways had connections into visual processing regions, the brain would naturally learn to interpret thermal patterns as visual information. The experience would probably not be like visible light. Infrared and visible light have different properties, creating different types of images. But over evolutionary time, as these capabilities developed, the brain would optimize its processing to make useful sense of the combined visual and thermal information stream. One challenge to the hypothesis is the question of resolution. The wavelength of infrared radiation is much longer than visible light, which places physical limits on the sharpness of thermal images. To achieve the kind of detailed thermal vision that would be useful for hunting or navigation, you'd need either very large apertures or an array of sensors. But both solutions are biologically possible. The distribution of thermal receptors across facial structures rather than concentrating them in eye-sized organs might actually provide better thermal imaging resolution than a single small sensor could achieve. Another consideration is the metabolic cost. Maintaining highly sensitive thermal receptors and the neural machinery to process their signals would require energy, not enormous amounts, but non-trivial given that the brain is already the body's most energy-hungry organ. This cost would need to be offset by survival advantages. In the Pleistocene, when humans lived as hunter-gatherers in environments filled with megafauna, some dangerous, some edible, the ability to detect animals in darkness or dense vegetation could easily provide enough benefit to justify the energy expenditure. You'd see prey before competitors found it. You'd detect predators before they got close. You'd navigate safely in conditions that would immobilize others. But as human ecology changed, more use of fire, more social cooperation, development of technologies like spears and eventually bows that allowed hunting at distance during daylight, establishment of settlements that provided greater safety, the incremental benefit of thermal vision would diminish. At some point, the cost-benefit analysis would tip, and individuals born with slightly less sophisticated thermal sensing wouldn't be at a significant disadvantage. Natural selection would cease to maintain the system against the inevitable accumulation of degrading mutations, and over thousands of generations, the capability would erode. Perhaps you're noticing how the pieces might fit together, how what seems like fantasy starts to acquire a structure of plausibility. If so, if the possibility that this mystery is rooted in actual biology rather than pure imagination resonates with you, then you're ready to consider the final pieces of the puzzle. The transition from a world where thermal vision is normal to one where it's merely mythological would play out over timescales difficult for us to fully grasp. Hundreds of generations, thousands of years. During this transition, the subjective experience of reality would be shifting, but so slowly that no single person would perceive the change. Children would be born with slightly less sensitive thermal perception than their parents on average, but the difference would be too subtle to notice directly. Over many generations, the cumulative effect would be profound, but at any given moment it would be invisible. This gradual fading creates a peculiar problem for cultural memory. If the change happens suddenly, a dramatic loss of ability in a single generation, it would be remembered clearly, discussed, analyzed, mourned. But a change that unfolds over centuries operates below the threshold of conscious cultural awareness. Each generation takes its own perceptual world as normal and assumes their ancestors experienced things the same way. The stories persist, but their meaning shifts. What was once description becomes metaphor. What was observation becomes mythology. We can see this process in action with other sensory capabilities. The ability to smell certain compounds, for instance, varies widely among humans. Some people can detect the distinctive odor of cyanide. Others cannot. Some can smell the metabolite that appears in urine after eating asparagus. Others are anosmic to it. These differences have genetic bases, and the prevalence of different variants shifts over time and across populations. But we don't have cultural memories of when everyone could smell cyanide or when that ability faded, because the change was gradual and the impact on daily life was minimal. Infrared vision would be different. Its loss would have more profound cultural implications because thermal perception, if it existed, would be integrated into so many aspects of life: hunting, navigation, social interaction, spiritual practice. As the capability faded, practices that depended on it would become less effective, then mysterious, then symbolic. Rituals that originally served practical purposes in a world of thermal vision would persist as empty forms, their original function forgotten. The cave paintings would continue to be created, but the artists would no longer fully understand why certain patterns were important, following tradition without comprehending the perceptual reality that gave rise to it. This might explain one of the persistent mysteries of ancient cave art. Why did the tradition eventually stop? After tens of thousands of years of creating painted galleries in deep caves, the practice largely ceased, not through any obvious catastrophe but through a gradual abandonment. Around 10,000 years ago, give or take a few millennia depending on region, the great painted caves stopped being created. Rock art continues, but the deep cave tradition, with its particular style and imagery, fades away. What if this cessation corresponds to the point where infrared vision had faded enough that the paintings no longer served their original purpose? If the paintings were, at least in part, documentary records of thermal perception, they would become increasingly incomprehensible as that perception disappeared. The tradition would lose its practical foundation, becoming merely ceremonial, then optional, then forgotten. At the same time, we see the emergence of new forms of symbolic expression and record-keeping. The period after the end of the cave painting tradition is when we begin to see the development of more abstract symbolic systems, eventually leading to writing. Could this represent a cognitive shift necessitated by the loss of infrared vision? If thermal patterns had once provided a kind of direct, intuitive information about animal presence, seasonal changes, environmental conditions, that information would need to be recorded and transmitted differently once the direct perception was gone. Writing, mathematics, calendars, these might represent, in part, compensatory technologies, ways of preserving and communicating knowledge that was once directly perceptible. The development of agriculture might also be relevant. Farming requires long-term thinking, planning across seasons, managing resources over annual cycles. These skills are less dependent on immediate sensory perception than hunting, where the ability to detect and track prey in real time is paramount. A society transitioning from hunting to farming would naturally experience a shift in which sensory capabilities matter most. The premium on acute sensory perception would decrease, while the value of memory, planning, and social coordination would increase. Could the Neolithic Revolution, the transition to agriculture, be connected to the fading of infrared vision? Not as a simple cause and effect relationship, but as interrelated aspects of a broader transformation in human ecology and cognition. As thermal perception faded, making certain forms of hunting less effective, the attractiveness of agriculture would increase. And as societies became more agricultural, more sedentary, more dependent on fire and constructed shelters, the selection pressure maintaining thermal vision would further relax. The two processes might have reinforced each other in a feedback loop. This raises an uncomfortable question about progress. We typically view the Neolithic Revolution as straightforwardly progressive, humans cleverly inventing agriculture, developing civilization, moving from primitive to advanced. But what if it was also compensatory? What if it represented, in part, an adaptation to diminished sensory capabilities, a way of surviving and thriving after the loss of perceptual abilities that had once been crucial? Progress and loss, intertwined. This perspective doesn't diminish human achievement. The development of agriculture, writing, mathematics, and complex civilization required tremendous ingenuity and represents a different kind of sophistication than the sensory richness we may have lost. But it suggests that our path wasn't simply upward toward greater capability, but sideways, trading certain abilities for others, adapting to changing circumstances including changes in our own bodies and brains. Let's examine what contemporary neuroscience tells us about sensory plasticity, because this bears directly on the plausibility of major changes in human perception occurring within the time frame we're discussing. The human brain is not a static computer running fixed programs. It's a dynamic, self-organizing system that adapts continuously to the sensory information it receives and to the tasks it needs to perform. Studies of sensory substitution devices provide compelling evidence for this plasticity. Blind individuals using devices that translate visual information into tactile or auditory signals can learn to see through these alternative modalities. After training, their brains process the substituted sensory information in visual cortex, not just in the regions normally associated with touch or sound. The visual cortex, it turns out, is not fundamentally about processing signals from the eyes. It's about processing certain kinds of spatial and pattern information, and it will accept that information from whatever source provides it. This means that the neural machinery for visual processing could potentially handle input from thermal sensors just as readily as from photoreceptors, given appropriate connections. The hard part wouldn't be getting the brain to process thermal information. Brains are generalists when it comes to information processing, but rather developing the peripheral sensory apparatus and the neural pathways to get that information into the right processing regions. Evolution has produced such systems multiple times in different lineages, suggesting that the genetic and developmental steps required are not prohibitively complex. Infrared vision has evolved independently in snakes, certain fish, and some insects. Each lineage solved the problem differently, using different molecular machinery and different neural architectures, but all arrived at functional infrared perception. This evolutionary convergence suggests that there are multiple viable paths to thermal imaging, increasing the likelihood that human ancestors might have stumbled onto one of them. The genetic changes required might be surprisingly modest. Many major adaptations in evolution result not from the invention of entirely new genes but from modifications to the regulation of existing genes. Changes in where, when, or how strongly a gene is expressed. The ion channels and neural machinery for temperature sensation already exist in humans. Shifting their sensitivity, changing their distribution, routing their signals to different brain regions. These are the kinds of regulatory changes that could produce significantly different sensory capabilities without requiring fundamentally new biological components. There's also the question of individual variation. Even in modern humans, sensory capabilities vary considerably. Visual acuity, color perception, auditory sensitivity, olfactory discrimination, all show substantial variation within populations. Some of this variation is genetic, some environmental, some reflects different developmental outcomes from the same genetic blueprints. If there's this much variation in well-studied, clearly functional sensory systems, how much more variation might exist in residual or vestigial capabilities? Testing for retained thermal perception in modern humans would be challenging but not impossible. You'd need to carefully control for conventional sensory cues, ensuring that subjects couldn't see, hear, or feel subjects through air currents or conducted heat, and then test whether they could detect or discriminate heat sources at distances beyond what normal skin thermoreception could explain. Some informal experiments along these lines have been conducted, usually in the context of investigating paranormal claims, and while most results have been negative or ambiguous, there have been occasional tantalizing exceptions. Individuals who perform above chance in detecting heat sources under controlled conditions. The problem is that these investigations have rarely been conducted with rigorous scientific protocols or with an understanding that they might be testing for vestigial infrared perception rather than supernatural abilities. A proper investigation would require careful subject screening, sophisticated experimental design, and patience to identify the small percentage of individuals who might possess enhanced thermal sensitivity. It would be a difficult research program to fund and execute, especially given the skepticism that the hypothesis naturally generates. Yet the question persists because the circumstantial evidence, while not conclusive, forms a coherent pattern. The mythology suggesting sensory capabilities we no longer possess. The archaeological record showing artifacts and practices that make more sense if thermal perception is assumed. The biological plausibility of the capability and its loss. The global distribution of similar stories despite geographic isolation. The timing that corresponds to major transitions in human culture and ecology. Each element individually can be explained away. The myths are just imaginative inventions. The artifacts' thermal properties are coincidental. The biological mechanisms are theoretically possible, but there's no evidence they ever existed in humans. The global distribution of stories is chance or reflects universal psychological themes. The timing correlations are spurious. Taken together, though, the pattern is harder to dismiss as mere coincidence. This is the nature of evidence for events in the deep past, especially events that involve biological capabilities that might leave little direct trace in the archaeological record. We work with fragments, hints, patterns that might be meaningful or might be illusions created by our desire to see connections. The honest position is to remain uncertain while acknowledging the possibility, to hold the question open rather than prematurely closing it with either credulous acceptance or dismissive rejection. The implications, if the hypothesis were true, would extend beyond historical curiosity. It would fundamentally change how we understand human evolution, not as a simple progression toward greater capability but as a complex trade-off, gaining certain abilities while losing others. It would encourage us to question what other capabilities might have been lost or might currently be fading. It would add a note of humility to our historical reconstructions, reminding us that the past might be stranger, and ancient peoples might have been more different from us than we typically assume. Perhaps the most profound implication lies in how this hypothesis, if true, would reframe our understanding of memory, not just personal or cultural memory, but the deeper biological memory encoded in genes, in brain structures, in the residual capabilities that linger in populations even after they're functional. Utility has passed. We think of ourselves as living entirely in the present, our bodies and minds shaped by recent history. But we are also archaeological sites, containing layers of older design, ancient solutions to problems we no longer face, capabilities tuned for worlds we no longer inhabit. Consider the appendix, that small organ attached to the large intestine, long considered a useless vestige. Recent research suggests it may still serve a minor function as a reservoir for beneficial gut bacteria, but clearly, it's a diminished remnant of something that was once more significant in our evolutionary ancestors. Or consider the erector pili muscles that cause our hairs to stand on end when we're cold or frightened. In furry mammals, this creates an insulating layer of air or makes the animal appear larger to predators. In largely hairless humans, it does almost nothing practical, yet we retain the full neural and muscular apparatus to make it happen. These are memories written in flesh, biological archives of past adaptations. If infrared vision once existed in human ancestors, even if it's now completely gone, we might carry remnants, neural structures that once processed thermal information, receptors that once detected infrared radiation, genetic sequences that once coded for enhanced thermal sensitivity. These remnants would be subtle, degraded, possibly reused for other purposes by the brain's plastic capacity for reassignment. But they would be there, waiting for the right kind of investigation to reveal them. This raises the tantalizing question of whether the capability could be recovered. If the genetic basis for infrared vision is merely suppressed or degraded rather than completely deleted from the human genome, might it be possible, using modern genetic technology, to reactivate or restore it? This edges into science fiction, certainly, but the boundary between science fiction and future science has proven permeable. We already have the ability to edit genes with reasonable precision, to insert genes from one species into another, to modify sensory capabilities in experimental animals. The ethical implications of such an attempt would be complex. Would restoring infrared vision to humans constitute enhancement or repair? Would it be fundamentally different from using night vision goggles or thermal cameras, technological prostheses that extend our senses? Would individuals with restored infrared vision see themselves as modified humans or as returned to a more complete version of human sensory experience? These questions may remain theoretical. The practical challenges of identifying the full genetic and developmental basis for a complex sensory capability, then safely introducing or reactivating it in living humans, would be immense. But the mere possibility forces us to think differently about what we are and what we might become, or become again. There's a parallel here to language. We know that all modern humans have essentially the same language faculty, the same basic cognitive architecture for acquiring and using complex grammatical systems. But this capability is recent in evolutionary terms, emerging probably within the last 100,000 years, perhaps more recently. Before that, our ancestors presumably had more limited communication abilities. Did they experience the loss of whatever earlier communication methods they used? Did they tell stories of a time when people understood each other differently, more directly, without the cumbersome mediation of words? We can't know, because the prelinguistic past has left no direct records, only the anatomical changes visible in fossils and the complex languages of modern humans that testify to the power of the capability once it emerged. But the analogy is instructive. Major changes in human cognitive and sensory capabilities can occur on timescales of tens of thousands of years, sometimes leaving little direct evidence, sometimes transforming the human experience so thoroughly that we struggle to imagine what the earlier state was like. If infrared vision was lost over a similar timescale, during the same general period that saw the emergence of fully modern language, complex art, sophisticated tools, and eventually agriculture and civilization, then we're dealing with a period of extraordinary transformation in human evolution. Not just cultural evolution, the usual focus of discussions about recent human history, but biological evolution, changes in the actual physical and sensory apparatus that mediates our experience of reality. This period, roughly from 50,000 to 10,000 years ago, what archaeologists call the Upper Paleolithic and Mesolithic, has long been recognized as special. It's when we see the first unambiguous evidence of symbolic thought, art, music, complex social structures, long-distance trade. Something changed in the human mind during this time. The traditional explanation is that cultural evolution accelerated, that humans suddenly began inventing and transmitting knowledge more effectively. But what if there were also biological changes, not in intelligence per se, but in the specific sensory and cognitive architecture, the particular way that human brains processed information about the world? The loss of infrared vision, if it occurred, would be part of this larger transformation, possibly contributing to it. Without the ability to directly perceive thermal patterns, humans would need to develop different strategies for navigation, hunting, social interaction. These compensatory strategies might have driven the development of enhanced verbal communication, more sophisticated planning, greater reliance on shared cultural knowledge rather than individual sensory acuity. The loss might have been a forcing function for the kind of intensive cultural complexity that characterizes modern human societies. This suggests a different relationship between biology and culture than we usually imagine. We tend to think of culture as something humans created using fixed biological capabilities. But perhaps the relationship is more dynamic, with cultural developments both responding to and driving biological changes, a coevolutionary dance that shaped both body and mind. The emotional dimension of this possible loss deserves consideration as well. If infrared vision once existed and faded, how would that fading have been experienced by the cultures living through it? Not consciously, perhaps, as we've discussed. The change would be too gradual for any individual to notice. But there might have been a growing sense of something being wrong, a feeling that the world was becoming dimmer, less legible, more mysterious in ways that were frustrating rather than enchanting. The myths themselves often carry this emotional tone. Stories of a golden age when people possessed abilities they no longer have, when the world was more alive, more directly perceptible, more connected to human awareness. We typically read these as metaphors for lost innocence or social simplicity. But what if they also preserve a genuine grief for lost sensory richness, a dimly remembered wholeness of perception that the storytellers could no longer quite access but sensed had once existed? This grief would manifest in attempts to recover the lost capability or to compensate for it. The development of night vision technologies in modern times, image intensifiers, thermal cameras, infrared scopes, might represent not just practical problem-solving but a deeper drive to restore a capability we ancestrally possessed. We're drawn to these technologies not just because they're useful but because they resonate with something in our biological memory, satisfying a hunger we can't quite name. Similarly, the persistent human fascination with enhanced perception, superpowers in fiction, shamanic vision quests in traditional cultures, the use of psychedelic substances to alter perception, might partly reflect this ancestral loss. We sense that perception could be different, richer, and we seek ways to expand it, not knowing that we might be seeking not forward toward new capabilities but backward toward ones we once had. The artistic representation of heat and light in various cultural traditions might also reflect this lost sensory dimension. The halos around sacred figures in religious art, the glowing aureoles of saints and Buddhas, the radiant crowns of deities. We interpret these as symbolic representations of holiness or enlightenment. But the language used to describe these perceptions in mystical texts is often remarkably specific, describing heat, light, and energy in ways that seem more experiential than purely metaphorical. Could some of these descriptions preserve experiences of seeing thermal patterns, either in individuals who retained vestigial infrared sensitivity or in altered states of consciousness where normal sensory gating is disrupted? The concept of the aura, present in various spiritual traditions, describes a field of energy or light surrounding the body, invisible to normal sight but perceptible to sensitives or trained practitioners. Descriptions of auras often include colors that correspond to emotional or physical states, and frequently mention variations in intensity and quality around different parts of the body. This corresponds remarkably well to what thermal imaging reveals. The body does have a heat field around it, with variations in temperature distribution that correlate with circulation, metabolism, and physical condition. Could the persistent cross-cultural belief in auras reflect fragmented cultural memory of thermal perception? These speculations edge into territory that makes many scientifically minded people uncomfortable, and understandably so. The connection between myth, spiritual experience, and physical reality is treacherous ground, littered with the wreckage of grand theories that turned out to be wishful thinking. But dismissing these connections entirely means potentially overlooking genuine insights preserved in non-scientific forms of knowledge. The challenge is to take traditional knowledge seriously without taking it literally, to recognize that mythological and spiritual frameworks might encode real observations about the world, even if the explanatory models attached to those observations don't match modern scientific understanding. If we can bracket our reflexive skepticism just enough to examine what these traditions might be describing in experiential terms, patterns sometimes emerge that connect to physical reality in unexpected ways. Consider the chakra system in Indian traditions, which describes energy centers in the body associated with different functions and qualities. These centers correspond roughly to locations of major nerve plexuses and endocrine glands, and the descriptions of their functioning bear some relationship to what we understand about autonomic nervous system regulation. The chakras are also described as producing heat or cold, with meditation practices aimed at feeling and manipulating these thermal sensations. Is this entirely metaphorical, or does it preserve some genuine perceptual tradition, possibly rooted in enhanced internal thermal sensing? The point is not to validate any particular spiritual system, but to recognize that human cultures have been observing and documenting aspects of experience for thousands of years, and some of those observations might be recording real phenomena that our current scientific framework has not yet fully investigated. The hypothesis that humans once possessed infrared vision opens a space to reconsider many traditional claims about perception and sensory experience that have been dismissed as purely supernatural, examining whether they might instead represent attempts to describe capabilities that were once natural but have become rare or lost. This interpretive approach requires careful balance. On one hand, we can't simply accept traditional claims at face value. They're embedded in explanatory frameworks that include much we know to be incorrect. On the other hand, completely dismissing them as fantasy means potentially losing access to observational knowledge accumulated over millennia. The productive stance is one of informed curiosity. What might this tradition be describing experientially, even if its explanatory model is wrong? What observations might be preserved within mythological or spiritual language? The scientific investigation required to definitively answer the infrared vision question would be substantial, requiring cooperation across multiple disciplines and methodologies. Let's consider what such an investigation might entail, acknowledging both its challenges and its potential. The first line of inquiry would be genetic and molecular. We'd need to examine thermal sensing genes in detail across diverse human populations, looking for variations that might affect sensitivity or function. Comparison with archaic human DNA from Neanderthals, Denisovans, and any other specimens available would be crucial. Do they show different versions of thermal sensing genes? Then comparison with our closest primate relatives, chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, looking for what changed specifically in the human lineage. Have thermal receptor genes been under selective pressure in humans? Are there pseudogenes or degraded gene fragments suggesting loss of function? Are there population differences that correlate with geographic or cultural factors? This genetic work would need to be paired with functional analysis. You can't deduce everything about sensory capability from DNA alone. You need to test how the proteins actually behave. This means laboratory studies of human thermal receptors, measuring their sensitivity, response times, and signal characteristics. Comparison with thermal receptors from animals with infrared vision would establish whether human variants show any signatures of having been more sophisticated in the past. Neural imaging would be another crucial component. Using fMRI or other techniques, researchers would examine how thermal information is processed in the human brain. Map the pathways from peripheral thermoreceptors to cortical regions. Look for connections to visual processing areas that might represent vestigial cross-modal integration. Study individuals who report unusual thermal sensitivity to see whether their brains show distinctive patterns of thermal information processing. Investigate whether there are neural structures that seem overbuilt for current thermal sensing needs, suggesting past functionality. Archaeological analysis would need to be reoriented around the infrared hypothesis. Re-examine cave paintings, specifically looking for patterns that might represent thermal phenomena. Use computer modeling to simulate how various scenes would appear in infrared, comparing those simulations to actual painted images. Look for correlations between painting techniques or materials and thermal properties. Analyze the distribution and characteristics of non-figurative symbols for patterns consistent with thermal representation. Tool analysis through a thermal lens would examine whether the specific materials, shapes, and uses of prehistoric tools show optimization for infrared visibility or thermal properties beyond what would be expected from mechanical function alone. Study whether there are tools whose function has been mysterious but which make sense as thermal manipulation or thermal reference devices. Anthropological work would systematically catalog and analyze myths and traditions related to thermal perception across cultures, looking for patterns in their distribution, content, and estimated age. Conduct linguistic analysis to see whether languages show evidence of having once had more sophisticated vocabulary for thermal perception. Interview members of traditional cultures about perceptual experiences, particularly among individuals identified as having special sensitivity or shamanic abilities. Experimental psychology would be needed to test for residual thermal perception in modern humans. Design rigorous protocols to screen large populations for individuals who can detect or discriminate thermal sources at distances beyond normal skin thermoreception. Test whether performance can be enhanced through training, suggesting latent capabilities. Investigate correlates of enhanced thermal sensitivity. Are certain genetic variants, personality types, or neurological profiles associated with better performance? The challenges facing such a research program would be formidable. Funding would be difficult, the hypothesis is speculative, and resources for research are limited. Interdisciplinary coordination is always challenging, requiring experts from different fields with different methodologies and assumptions to work together effectively. The evidence being sought is subtle, the predicted effects are small, and the possibilities for negative results or ambiguous findings are high. Many individual studies might be inconclusive, requiring meta-analysis across multiple investigations to detect patterns. Yet in some ways, this is the most interesting kind of scientific question, one where the hypothesis is plausible but uncertain, where multiple lines of evidence must converge to reach conclusions, where the answer genuinely isn't known and might surprise us. These are the questions that drive science forward, even when, perhaps especially when, the investigation doesn't yield clear-cut positive results, because the process of investigation reveals new knowledge about human biology, evolution, and culture regardless of the specific hypothesis being tested. If you're intrigued by the possibility that serious scientific investigation could actually address this question, that it's not merely science fiction or mythology but a genuine empirical problem with potential approaches to solution, then perhaps you sense what makes this exploration valuable even without definitive answers. The journey of investigation itself, the careful assembly and analysis of evidence, the willingness to consider unexpected possibilities while maintaining rigorous standards, this is where understanding grows. The pragmatic question is whether such an investigation will ever be undertaken. In the current scientific landscape, resources flow toward questions with clearer near-term applications or toward investigations where the probability of definitive results seems higher. A question about whether humans once possessed infrared vision falls into a difficult category, potentially fascinating but practically inconsequential, requiring substantial resources with uncertain payoff. Yet science has often made surprising progress on questions that initially seemed too speculative or impractical to investigate seriously. The existence of DNA was highly speculative before it was proven. The idea that continents move was dismissed as absurd before plate tectonics. The notion that birds are descended from dinosaurs seemed ridiculous before the fossil evidence accumulated. Sometimes seemingly far-fetched hypotheses turn out to describe reality, and the investigation required to determine that produces unexpected insights that justify the effort even beyond the specific question. Let's turn now to what the loss of infrared vision, if it occurred, might mean for our understanding of consciousness and subjective experience. Philosophers and cognitive scientists have long grappled with the problem of qualia, the subjective, felt quality of experience. What it's like to see red, to taste salt, to feel pain. These qualitative experiences seem to resist objective description. You can't explain to someone born blind what red looks like, not because our language is inadequate but because the experience itself is irreducibly subjective. If humans once possessed infrared vision and lost it, then there exists a qualia that our ancestors experienced but we cannot. The subjective feeling of seeing infrared, whatever that was like, is inaccessible to us not just practically but fundamentally because we lack the neural machinery to generate that experience. This means that the subjective experiential world of our ancestors was genuinely different from ours, not just in content, they saw different things, but in quality, they had different types of experience. This has implications for how we think about consciousness. Much discussion in philosophy of mind treats consciousness as if it's a fixed, universal human attribute. Yes, the contents of consciousness vary, you think different thoughts than I do, but the structure and nature of conscious experience is assumed to be constant across all humans. But if sensory capabilities can change significantly over evolutionary time, then the structure of consciousness can change too. The flavor, the texture, the dimensional quality of subjective experience for our infrared perceiving ancestors would have been different from ours. Try to imagine it, though you can't really succeed. Your visual field, right now, presents colors, reds, blues, greens, and all the shades between. This is a three-dimensional color space, determined by the fact that you have 3 types of cone cells in your eyes, each sensitive to different wavelengths. Some animals have fewer cone types and see fewer colors. Some have more and see colors we can't imagine. Now add another dimension, another type of visual information that's not quite color and not quite brightness but something else, something related to the heat signature of objects. Your visual field wouldn't just have more colors, it would have an additional quality that doesn't exist in your current experience, can't be described in terms of your current experience, is as fundamentally different from color as color is from sound. Living with that additional dimension of perception would fundamentally alter how you orient to the world. Your sense of which things are similar or different would change. Objects that look alike in visible light might be utterly different in their thermal signatures. Your emotional responses would be shaped by thermal aesthetics we can't imagine. Your social interactions would include thermal communication. You'd see people's thermal responses to emotions, excitement causing increased peripheral blood flow, fear causing constriction, the warmth of affection or arousal. Your relationship to darkness would be fundamentally different. Night wouldn't be a void, but simply a different kind of visibility. The loss of this dimension would be, in a sense, a narrowing of consciousness, a reduction in the richness of phenomenal experience. But it wouldn't necessarily be experienced as loss by those who never possessed it. You don't feel deprived of tetrachromatic vision or echolocation or magnetic field sensing, even though these are capabilities some organisms possess and you don't, because you have no experiential reference for them. You can't miss what you've never known. But during the transitional period, when infrared vision was fading, there might have been a generation gap in subjective experience unlike anything we currently deal with. Imagine children growing up unable to fully perceive something their parents could see, and the parents unable to adequately explain what was missing, because the experience being lost was qualia, not just information. The alienation, the sense that the world had diminished in ways that couldn't be articulated, would be profound. This might be part of what's preserved in myths of the fall, the lost paradise, the golden age when people were more connected to the world. Yes, these myths serve many psychological and social functions. But they might also carry genuine memory of a time when human consciousness was differently configured, when subjective experience had a richness that later generations couldn't quite grasp but sensed had once existed. From a modern perspective, we might not consider the loss of infrared vision to be a fall at all. We've developed other capabilities, other ways of engaging with the world. Our consciousness is shaped by language, abstraction, technology in ways that might not have been possible if we'd remained perceptually bound to immediate sensory richness. The trade-off might have been necessary, even beneficial in the long term. But acknowledging that it was a trade-off, not simply progress, changes how we think about human evolution and human potential. It also raises questions about future changes. Is human consciousness continuing to evolve? Are we currently losing or gaining sensory or cognitive capabilities, too gradually to notice within a single lifetime but cumulatively significant? Some researchers worry that increasing reliance on digital technology is changing our memory, attention, and social cognition. Others argue that it's simply shifting these capabilities into new configurations, not better or worse but different. The parallel to the infrared vision question is clear. We may be living through perceptual and cognitive changes that future generations will try to understand through their own necessarily limited experiential framework. If this line of thinking opens questions about what consciousness is and could be, about how the felt quality of experience might be far less universal than we assume, then perhaps you're beginning to grasp why this mystery touches something deeper than merely historical curiosity. The relationship between technology and biology in this story is worth examining more closely. We typically think of technology as compensation for biological limitations. We can't fly, so we build aircraft. We can't see distant objects clearly, so we invent telescopes. We can't survive in space, so we create life support systems. Technology extends our capabilities beyond what biology provides. But what if some technologies represent not extension beyond natural limits but recovery of capabilities we once possessed biologically? Night vision and thermal imaging devices might fall into this category if the infrared hypothesis is correct. We didn't invent ways to see in the dark and perceive heat. We reinvented them technologically after losing them biologically. This reframing changes the trajectory we imagine for human development. Instead of a straight line from limited biological creature to technologically enhanced being, we might be traveling in loops, rediscovering capabilities we had before, approaching them differently but arriving at functionally similar outcomes. The thermal camera on a smartphone gives you infrared vision, just not through your eyes. You've recovered the capability but in a form that requires external devices rather than internal biology. Is this better or worse? The technological approach has advantages. You can turn it on and off, upgrade it, share it easily, apply it in ways that biological infrared vision couldn't match. But it also has costs, dependence on devices and power sources, the mediation of direct experience through technology, the potential for technical failure or controlled access. When your senses are biological, they're part of you, automatically available, integrated into your experience. When they're technological, they're tools you use, separate from your embodied self. The modern human relationship to technology might be shaped by this deep biological history of loss and recovery. We're drawn to technologies that extend perception because we're trying to return to a sensory richness we once had. The appeal of virtual reality, augmented reality, sensory enhancement technologies might reflect not just novelty-seeking but a deeper drive to restore wholeness to perception, to see more, experience more, recover dimensions of reality that have become invisible to our diminished senses. This suggests a different way of thinking about transhumanism and human enhancement. Usually, these movements frame themselves as about transcending biological limitations, becoming something more than merely human. But perhaps we're not transcending so much as recovering, not adding to humanity but restoring dimensions of it that have been lost. The enhanced humans of the future, with their sensory implants and cognitive augmentations, might not be post-human at all but rather neo-ancient, recreating through technology the capabilities our ancestors possessed biologically. There's both humility and ambition in this vision. Humility in recognizing that our current biological state might not represent the apex of human possibility, that we may have lost important capabilities along the way. Ambition in believing we can consciously choose to recover or recreate what evolution has let slip away, that we're not bound by our biology's current configuration. The ethical questions multiply. If we develop the capability to genetically restore infrared vision or other lost senses, who gets access? Would it create a sensory divide between enhanced and unenhanced humans? Would it be morally obligatory to restore capabilities we once had? Or is our current sensory configuration fine as is? How would society function if some people could perceive dimensions of reality others couldn't? But perhaps we're already living in that reality. Technology has created perceptual inequality. Some people have access to sophisticated sensors, imaging systems, data visualization tools that reveal aspects of reality invisible to others. We navigate this by understanding that these technologies are available in principle, that the knowledge they produce can be shared, translated, made accessible. Biological sensory differences would be harder to bridge but not necessarily impossible to manage. More troubling is the question of what else we might have lost beyond infrared vision. If one major sensory capability can fade from human biology within the relevant time frame, might others have as well? Could we have once had more acute hearing, able to perceive sounds now beyond our range? More sensitive smell, matching or exceeding that of dogs? Enhanced proprioception, able to sense our body's position and movement with greater precision? Better time perception, able to track temporal patterns we now find elusive? Each of these would leave different traces in the archaeological and mythological record, different patterns in contemporary human biology. Each would potentially be recoverable through different investigative approaches. And each would suggest that the human sensory experience has been more varied, more dynamic, more subject to evolutionary change than we typically assume. The paleontological perspective is instructive here. The fossil record shows that major sensory systems have changed radically over evolutionary time. Early mammals, living in the shadow of dinosaurs, likely had enhanced olfaction and hearing, being primarily nocturnal. When primates moved into the trees and developed color vision, these adaptations came at the cost of olfactory acuity. You can see this in the anatomy, with primates having much reduced olfactory bulbs compared to other mammals. Vision was favored, smell diminished. Neither state is better in absolute terms. Each represents optimization for different lifestyles and environments. Humans continued this trend, developing exceptional visual acuity and color vision, while further reducing olfactory capability. But we shouldn't assume this process stopped 50,000 years ago or that vision was the only sense affected. The entire sensory suite has likely continued to evolve, with gains in some areas and losses in others, throughout the period of modern human existence. If you sense that this question opens onto much larger uncertainties about what humans are and have been, about how much we can trust our sensory experience to reveal the world as it actually is, then you're approaching the heart of why this mystery matters philosophically, not just historically. Let's consider one more dimension of this question before we draw toward a conclusion: what it might mean for our understanding of ancient monuments and structures. We've touched on this earlier, but it deserves deeper exploration, because if infrared vision existed, it would have profoundly affected how ancient peoples designed and constructed their most important buildings. Take Stonehenge, that iconic circle of massive stones on the Salisbury Plain. The conventional understanding focuses on its astronomical alignments. The heel stone frames the sunrise on summer solstice. Various other stones mark lunar events and seasonal transitions. This is understood as a sophisticated calendar, a way of tracking celestial cycles for religious and practical purposes. But imagine experiencing Stonehenge if you could see in infrared. Stone has high thermal mass. It absorbs heat slowly during the day and releases it slowly at night. Different types of stone have different thermal properties. The massive stones of Stonehenge, absorbing sunlight all day, would glow with stored heat for hours after sunset. The temperature distribution wouldn't be uniform. South-facing surfaces would be warmer, the tops of stones warmer than bases. The interior of the circle would have different thermal patterns than the exterior. As the seasons changed, these patterns would shift with maximum contrast at the solstices and equinoxes. For someone with infrared vision, Stonehenge wouldn't go dark at sunset. Instead, it would transform, becoming a complex pattern of heat distribution that changed throughout the night and across the year. The structure would be a thermal calendar as much as a celestial one, encoding seasonal information in patterns of warmth and cold that would be directly visible to infrared-perceiving eyes. This interpretation doesn't contradict the astronomical understanding. It adds to it. Stonehenge could function simultaneously as a celestial observatory in visible light and a thermal calendar in infrared. The builders might have chosen particular stones partly for their thermal properties, testing how different rocks absorbed and released heat, selecting combinations that would create the desired patterns. The same analysis applies to other megalithic sites. The temples of Malta with their massive limestone blocks. The structures at Göbekli Tepe with their T-shaped pillars. The passage tombs of Ireland with their corbelled chambers. All of these would have distinctive thermal behaviors, creating patterns of heat distribution that would be visible to infrared perception. Some features of these structures make more sense through a thermal lens. Many megalithic sites are oriented not just to celestial events but to wind patterns and sun exposure. This is usually understood as practical design, making the structures comfortable, sheltering them from storms, maximizing warmth in winter. But these same factors would create distinctive thermal signatures. A structure oriented to catch the morning sun would show warming patterns that could serve as a daily clock for those who could see them. The use of multiple stone types within single structures is another feature that might be thermally motivated. At Stonehenge, the massive sarsen stones forming the outer circle are a different rock type than the smaller blue stones of the inner arrangement. The conventional explanation focuses on the sacred significance attributed to the blue stones, which were transported from Wales, nearly 200 kilometers away. But sarsens and bluestones have different thermal properties. They heat and cool at different rates, creating contrasting thermal patterns. A designer sensitive to thermal aesthetics might choose stone combinations specifically for their heat behavior. Interior spaces in megalithic structures often show sophisticated understanding of heat retention and circulation. Passage tombs like Newgrange in Ireland maintain remarkably stable temperatures, cool in summer, relatively warm in winter. This is usually understood as incidental, a side effect of massive construction and earth covering. But what if thermal stability was an intentional design goal, creating spaces that would appear distinctive in infrared, thermally stable islands in a thermally fluctuating landscape? The alignment of these structures might also have thermal dimensions we don't currently recognize. We know that many ancient structures are aligned to solstice or equinox sunrises and sunsets. At these moments, light penetrates deep into chambers or illuminates specific stones or marks. But sunlight carries heat as well as light, and these alignment events would create thermal phenomena, sudden warming of specific surfaces, heat focused along particular passages, thermal gradients that would be visible in infrared. Imagine being inside Newgrange on winter solstice morning, when light penetrates down the passage to illuminate the chamber. Invisible light, this is a dramatic shaft of brightness in darkness. But in infrared, it would also be a pulse of heat, warming the stones it touches, creating thermal patterns that would persist after the visible light had passed. The experience would be richer, more multidimensional, for someone who could see both spectra. This suggests that our modern reconstructions of ancient ceremonies and practices might be missing crucial dimensions. When we imagine ancient peoples gathering at megalithic sites for rituals, we envision them experiencing these spaces as we would, through sight, sound, and the tactile sense of massive stones. But if they could also perceive thermal patterns, the experience would include dimensions we can't access. The spaces would be alive with thermal information, speaking in a language of warmth and cold that we can no longer read. The practical implications for archaeology are significant. If thermal properties were important design considerations in ancient structures, then archaeologists should be investigating these properties systematically, mapping thermal behaviors of sites at different times of day and year, testing whether patterns exist that might have been functionally or aesthetically significant to infrared perceiving designers. Some research along these lines has been done, though not usually with the infrared hypothesis in mind. Thermal surveys of ancient structures, mostly conducted to identify structural problems or hidden features, sometimes reveal unexpected patterns. At Egyptian temples, some stones remain notably warmer or cooler than others despite identical sun exposure. At various megalithic sites, thermal imaging has shown that certain structures have thermal properties that seem inconsistent with random construction. These findings are typically not interpreted as indicating design intent, but perhaps they should be reconsidered through that lens. The decoration and carving on ancient monuments might also have thermal dimensions. Many megalithic sites feature elaborate carvings, spirals, geometric patterns, stylized representations of celestial objects or natural phenomena. These carvings alter the thermal behavior of stone surfaces. Carved areas have greater surface area and therefore different rates of heating and cooling than smooth surfaces. Deep carvings create shadows that affect both visible appearance and thermal behavior. Could some carving patterns have been designed to create specific thermal effects, patterns of warmth and cold that would be visible to infrared perception? The spiral motif, ubiquitous in Neolithic art from Ireland to Malta to Göbekli Tepe, might be relevant here. Spirals have been interpreted in many ways, as representations of water, of celestial movements, of spiritual journeys, of altered states of consciousness. But a spiral carved into stone also creates a complex surface with varying thermal behavior, the carved lines potentially creating visible thermal patterns as they heat and cool at different rates than the surrounding stone. Testing this hypothesis would require detailed thermal imaging of carved stones under various lighting and temperature conditions, looking for patterns that might be aesthetically or informationally significant. Do the carvings create coherent thermal images? Do those images change in meaningful ways across daily or seasonal cycles? Are there correlations between the complexity of carving and the distinctiveness of thermal patterns? Beyond megalithic sites, we might reconsider many other aspects of ancient material culture through a thermal lens. Pottery, for instance, different clay compositions, surface treatments, and firing temperatures create vessels with different thermal properties. Some pottery retains heat longer, some transfers heat more quickly. If you could see these differences in infrared, you might select different vessels for different purposes based partly on their thermal signatures. The aesthetic appreciation of pottery might include thermal aesthetics we can't perceive. Textiles would have distinctive thermal properties based on material, weave, and dye. Wool, linen, cotton, and silk all interact differently with heat. Different weaving patterns create different thermal behaviors. Natural dyes might have thermal properties that affect the appearance of dyed cloth in infrared. A culture with infrared vision would potentially develop sophisticated textile arts that considered thermal aesthetics alongside visible color and pattern. Metalwork presents another domain where thermal properties might have been significant. Different metals and alloys have dramatically different thermal conductivity, specific heat capacity, and emissivity. Gold, silver, copper, bronze, iron, each behaves differently when heated or cooled. These differences would be visible in infrared, creating thermal contrasts that might be as important as visible color differences. The selection and combination of metals in jewelry, weapons, or ceremonial objects might reflect thermal aesthetic considerations. The archaeological study of ancient technologies, metallurgy, ceramics, glassmaking, has always recognized that these technologies involve careful control of heat. But the assumption has been that temperature control mattered because of its effect on the material properties of the finished product. What if it also mattered because the practitioners could see the thermal processes, watching in infrared as metals melted, as clay transformed, as glass fused? The knowledge transmission in these crafts might have relied partly on visual teaching of thermal patterns, with masters literally showing apprentices what the correct heat distribution looked like, not with thermometers but with direct thermal perception. This would explain some puzzling aspects of ancient technical knowledge. Many traditional crafts maintain sophisticated heat control without instruments, relying on visual cues we assume were indirect: the color of hot metal, the appearance of flames, the behavior of materials. But if practitioners could see heat directly, the learning and practice of these crafts would be fundamentally different. You wouldn't need to memorize that metal is the right temperature when it glows a particular color. You'd simply see when it reached the right temperature. The loss of infrared vision would have made these technologies harder to practice and teach. The necessary knowledge would need to be encoded differently, translated from direct thermal perception to indirect cues and abstract rules. Some technical knowledge might have been lost entirely in this translation, particularly subtle distinctions that were easy to see thermally but difficult to describe or detect through indirect means. This could contribute to the puzzle of how certain ancient technologies, like Damascus steel or Roman concrete, achieved properties that later practitioners struggled to reproduce. It might also explain why some ancient technologies seem to have declined or been lost even though the basic knowledge still existed. If the original practice depended on sensory capabilities that had faded, maintaining the tradition would become progressively harder. requiring more elaborate compensatory techniques and more explicit knowledge transmission. Eventually, the tradition might fail, not because the knowledge was deliberately lost but because it had become too difficult to practice without the sensory framework it was designed around. As we move toward drawing these threads together, it's worth reflecting on what it means to seriously entertain a hypothesis like this, to hold open the possibility that something fundamental about human sensory experience might have changed within the time frame of our species' existence. This is not comfortable intellectual territory. We prefer our ancestors to be either simple and primitive, making them easy to condescend to, or essentially like us but with less technology, making them easy to identify with. The possibility that they were neither simple nor the same, that they might have experienced the world through sensory capabilities we lack, creates a productive discomfort. This discomfort is valuable because it forces recognition of how much we don't know about the past, how many of our confident reconstructions rest on assumptions that might be wrong. The archaeological record is fragmentary, preserving only tiny fractions of ancient life, mostly durable materials like stone, bone, and ceramic, almost never preserving the full context of how these materials were actually used. We interpret these fragments through our own experience, inevitably projecting our sensory and cognitive framework onto peoples who might have been significantly different. This is not an argument for radical skepticism or the notion that we can know nothing about the past. Archaeological science has developed sophisticated methods for extracting information from material remains, and when multiple independent lines of evidence converge, we can be confident in our conclusions. But there's a difference between well-supported conclusions about specific matters. This site was occupied during this period, these tools were used for this purpose, and broader assumptions about the nature of ancient human experience. The infrared vision hypothesis may ultimately be wrong. The evidence, as we've seen, is suggestive but far from conclusive. Future investigation might definitively rule it out, showing that the genetic basis for such capability never existed in humans, that the archaeological patterns admit of better explanations, that the mythological parallels are coincidental. That would be a legitimate scientific conclusion, advancing our understanding by delimiting possibilities. But the hypothesis is not so absurd that it should be dismissed without investigation. The biological mechanisms are plausible. The evolutionary timeline is adequate. The circumstantial evidence forms patterns that deserve explanation. And the implications are significant enough that resolving the question either way would be valuable. If true, it would transform our understanding of human sensory evolution and ancient experience. If false, the investigation process would still produce new knowledge about human thermal perception, ancient technology, and the interpretation of archaeological remains. What makes this question particularly interesting is that it sits at the intersection of multiple domains: evolutionary biology, neuroscience, archaeology, anthropology, art history, mythology. No single discipline has all the tools needed to address it comprehensively. Progress would require genuine interdisciplinary collaboration, with experts from different fields willing to take seriously ideas that might seem outlandish from within their specific paradigm. This kind of collaboration is challenging to organize and fund, which is why many interesting questions at disciplinary boundaries remain underexplored. Academic research tends to favor questions that fit neatly within established fields, with clear methodologies and predictable timelines. Questions that require coordinating multiple approaches, that might not yield clear results, that challenge fundamental assumptions, these are harder to pursue, regardless of their intellectual merit. Yet science advances at least as much through investigating unexpected possibilities as through incremental refinement of established knowledge. The willingness to take seriously ideas that seem improbable, to design careful tests for unlikely hypotheses, to follow evidence wherever it leads even when it contradicts comfortable assumptions, this is what distinguishes scientific inquiry from mere confirmation of existing beliefs. The infrared vision hypothesis exemplifies this kind of thinking. It asks us to consider that an assumption we rarely even articulate, that human sensory experience has been essentially constant, might be wrong. It draws attention to evidence that's always been present but hasn't been interpreted through this particular framework. It suggests investigative approaches that could produce valuable knowledge even if the specific hypothesis isn't confirmed. Perhaps more importantly, it invites a particular stance toward the past. One of humility about our ability to fully understand ancient experience, curiosity about possibilities we haven't considered, and openness to evidence that might challenge our frameworks. These attitudes are valuable beyond any specific historical question because they guard against the overconfidence that leads to misinterpretation and misdiscoveries. The ancient world was strange. We know this in abstract terms. People lived differently, believed differently, organized societies differently. But we often underestimate how deep that strangeness might go. We assume that underneath cultural differences, the basic human experience was the same. They saw the same colors, heard the same sounds, felt the same sensations. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if the very texture of conscious experience has changed, not just culturally but biologically? This possibility should make us more careful and more imaginative in our historical interpretations. More careful because we can't simply assume that ancient peoples would have experienced artifacts and environments as we do. More imaginative because we need to consider possibilities beyond our immediate experience, thinking about how things might appear to beings with different sensory capabilities. If this extended exploration has changed how you think about the past, about human sensory experience, about what it means to encounter evidence that doesn't quite fit comfortable narratives, then perhaps it's accomplished something valuable regardless of whether infrared vision was real. The questions we ask shape the discoveries we make, and sometimes the most productive questions are those that seem initially improbable. Let's return now to where we began, with the cave paintings, those enigmatic images on stone walls that have captivated humans since their rediscovery. We've traveled far from that starting point, through genetics and neuroscience, mythology and megalithic structures, consciousness and technology. But the paintings remain central, because they're the most direct visual record we have of how ancient peoples saw their world. When you stand in Chauvet Cave or Lascaux or Altamira, looking at paintings created 20 or 30,000 years ago, you're seeing through a window into another mind. The hand that spread ochre and charcoal on stone was attached to a brain that thought and perceived and experienced. The question is, how similar was that brain to yours? How much would you recognize in that ancient consciousness, and how much might be fundamentally alien? The conventional answer is that they were basically like us, same cognitive capabilities, same sensory experience, just less accumulated cultural knowledge. This assumption underlies most archaeological interpretation. We look at their paintings and see what we would see, imagine that they painted what they saw, reconstruct their world as if it would look the same to us as it did to them. But what if it wouldn't? What if those overlapping figures, those strange aureoles, those abstract symbols scattered among the animals, reflect a perceptual reality we can't access? What if the artists were painting faithfully, documenting their world, but their world included visible dimensions that ours lacks? You can't prove this from the paintings alone. They admit multiple interpretations. But you also can't disprove it. The paintings remain stubbornly enigmatic, resisting our attempts to fully explain them. Every generation of scholars brings new interpretations, each seeming plausible for a time before its limitations become apparent. Hunting magic, shamanic visions, mythological narratives, abstract symbolism, artistic expression. Each framework captures something, but none feels complete. Perhaps no framework that assumes ancient and modern perception are identical can be complete. Perhaps the missing piece is the acknowledgement that we might be looking at these images through diminished senses, unable to see what their creators saw, both in the world around them and in the paintings themselves. This isn't to romanticize ancient peoples or claim they possessed supernatural abilities. If they could see infrared, it was a biological capability, as natural and unremarkable to them as color vision is to us. They wouldn't have experienced it as special any more than you experience trichromatic vision as special. It was just how sight worked, how the world appeared. But to us, looking back through the filter of biological change, that capability would seem remarkable precisely because it's lost. We're in the position of someone trying to imagine color from black and white photographs, attempting to reconstruct a sensory dimension we can't experience from artifacts that may have been created with that dimension in mind. The paintings might not be the only place where this limitation affects our understanding. Ancient texts, when they exist, might describe perceptual experiences we can't fully grasp. Ritual practices might have made sense in a world of richer sensory perception but seem arbitrary now. Navigation techniques, hunting strategies, architectural principles, All might reflect capabilities we no longer possess and therefore struggle to comprehend. This creates a kind of hermeneutic circle. We interpret ancient remains through our perceptual framework because it's all we have, but that framework might be inadequate to the task. We don't recognize that it's inadequate because we don't know what we're missing. The evidence that might reveal our limitations is present but invisible to us because we lack the very capabilities needed to recognize it. Breaking out of this circle requires willing to question fundamental assumptions. It requires taking seriously the possibility that the gaps in our understanding of ancient cultures might reflect not just lack of information but lack of perceptual access to the information that exists. It requires considering that when ancient sources describe seeing things we can't see, they might not be speaking metaphorically or supernaturally but describing actual perceptual experiences from a different sensory framework. This is not an easy stance to maintain. The pressure to explain everything in terms of what we know and can experience is powerful. Invoking lost sensory capabilities might seem like giving up, retreating into unknowability. But there's a difference between admitting ignorance and recognizing specific limitations. To say we don't know is vague and unproductive. To say we might not be able to see what they saw, and this specific evidence suggests they might have seen in infrared, is precise and testable. The paintings whisper their secrets, but we might not hear because we're listening for the wrong things. We're looking for narratives, for symbols, for cultural meanings, all legitimate approaches. But we might also need to look for perceptual records, for visual documentation of a world that included dimensions we can't access. The paintings might be both cultural expression and sensory archive, both art and documentary evidence of different vision. If so, then we're only halfway to understanding them. We can appreciate their beauty, analyze their composition, contextualize them culturally, but we can't fully see them as their creators did, can't perceive what they were attempting to capture, can't access the complete visual language in which they're written. This is not a failure. It's a recognition of legitimate limits, which is the first step toward potentially overcoming them. Once we recognize that we might be looking at the paintings with diminished vision, we can begin to ask what that fuller vision might have included, what evidence might reveal it, what investigations might recover some of what's been lost. So we arrive at the end of this exploration, though not at a conclusion in any definitive sense. The question remains open. Did the first humans possess infrared vision? The honest answer is that we don't know. The evidence is insufficient to confirm the hypothesis, but also insufficient to conclusively rule it out. We're left in that uncomfortable space of genuine uncertainty, where multiple possibilities remain viable and the truth awaits investigation that may or may not ever be undertaken. But the value of the question extends beyond its answer. By entertaining this possibility, by following its implications through multiple domains, we've opened space to think differently about human evolution, ancient experience, and the nature of perception itself. We've been reminded that our sensory framework, which seems so complete and natural, is actually contingent, shaped by evolutionary history, potentially different from what our ancestors possessed, possibly different from what our descendants will have. This recognition breeds humility about our historical interpretations and curiosity about what else we might be missing. If something as fundamental as sensory capability can change within the human lineage, what other assumptions about ancient peoples might be wrong? How much of what we confidently assert about the past rests on projecting our own experience onto people who might have been significantly different? The infrared hypothesis also illuminates the complex relationship between biology and culture, showing how biological changes can drive cultural evolution and vice versa. The loss of infrared vision, if it occurred, would have forced compensatory cultural developments, new technologies, different practices, altered ways of transmitting knowledge. These cultural changes would in turn affect which biological traits mattered for success, potentially accelerating the loss of thermal perception as cultural solutions made it less critical. This interplay between biology and culture is ongoing. We're living through it right now as technology transforms how we think, remember, and interact. Understanding that this process has shaped human history for thousands of years, sometimes in ways that involve actual biological change, helps frame current transformations not as unprecedented catastrophe but as the latest iteration of an ancient dynamic. The exploration also demonstrates how mythology and traditional knowledge might preserve insights that scientific investigation has yet to recover. The widespread stories of firesight and enhanced perception in ancestors might not be pure fantasy but cultural memory, distorted by time but retaining kernels of truth. This suggests an approach to traditional knowledge that's neither credulous acceptance nor dismissive rejection, but careful investigation into what experiential realities might underlie mythological expression. Perhaps most importantly, this question invites us to imagine the world as richer than it appears, not in mystical terms but in straightforward sensory dimensions that might exist beyond our perceptual access. The electromagnetic spectrum extends far beyond visible light, and various organisms perceive different portions of it. The world is full of information that exists but is invisible to human senses. Ultraviolet patterns on flowers that guide insect pollinators, magnetic fields that orient migratory birds, low-frequency vibrations that elephants use for long-distance communication. Infrared radiation is just one more part of physical reality that could be, and in some organisms is, directly perceived. That we don't perceive it is a fact about us, not about the universe. And facts about us can change. They have changed repeatedly throughout human evolution. They're probably still changing. Recognizing this dynamism, this lack of fixedness in human sensory and cognitive configuration, opens possibilities both inspiring and unsettling. The paintings in the caves, silent now for millennia, may hold secrets we're not equipped to read. The tools in museum cases may have been designed with considerations we can't appreciate. The myths passed down through countless generations may describe experiences we can't share. Or perhaps not, perhaps we're interpreting everything correctly through our current sensory framework, and there was no infrared vision to lose. Either way, the investigation is worthwhile because it forces us to question, to imagine, to remain uncertain where certainty isn't justified. As you return from this exploration to your ordinary perceptions, to the world as it appears in visible light alone, perhaps you'll retain some echo of the possibility that it could appear differently, that ancient humans might have seen more, that we walk through a world richer than our senses reveal. When you see thermal cameras in use, when you encounter myths of enhanced vision, when you contemplate cave paintings or ancient structures, perhaps you'll wonder whether these are glimpses of something that was once natural, now technologically or mythologically preserved. The night is dark to our eyes, but it need not be dark to all eyes. Heat radiates from every living thing, invisible to us but physically real, theoretically perceptible. Somewhere in the human past, eyes might have opened to this reality, and somewhere along the way they closed. Or perhaps they never opened at all, and this entire exploration has been an elaborate contemplation of something that never was. The uncertainty is the point, the reminder that our knowledge of the past is provisional, our interpretations are filtered through our own limitations, and the ancient world keeps its deepest secrets still. If this journey into the possibility of lost vision has given you new eyes to look at ancient mysteries, new questions to ask about human history, new humility about how much remains unknown, then perhaps it has restored, in metaphorical form, something of what might literally have been lost, the ability to see the world as stranger, richer, and more mysterious than it first appears. The evidence remains inconclusive, the question open, the investigation unfinished. And that, perhaps, is exactly as it should be.